crime conspiracy cults, serial killers, and murder, all things that I love to consume, and I know you do to you. Sick-minded, beautiful, intellectual freak. And today we are talking about something not necessarily positive, but they come out with a positive outcome, unlike most of the stories I talk about in my deep dives. Basically, we're talking about these three women had an encounter with a killer, and they lived to tell the tale, but their stories are absolutely heart-wrenching and insane, and so inspiring that I thought it would be really cool to tip my hat off to them and tell you their stories. So, without further ado, let's unbuckle her seat belts, go Mach 5 down the highway, slam on the brakes, and bust through the windshield into these awesome bad cases together. Music. So, the first story we're going to talk about is the story of Mary Vincent. So it was a typical September afternoon in 1978, hot and dry in Northern California, and 15-year-old Mary Vincent stood on the side of the road with her thumb out and a sign saying that she was going to Southern California. Don't hitchhike. I don't know how many times I've said that in my videos, but please, for the love of God, don't hitchhike. And obviously she was hoping for a ride. She was actually running away from home because she was very frustrated with her family life and her current relationship problems, and she was seeking refuge with her grandfather in Southern California. And Mary was one of 7 children born to parents struggling in a tumultuous marriage. Her father was a mechanic and married to her mother, who was a blackjack dealer, and during her parents' messy divorce, Vincent just found that she couldn't cope with all the turmoil that was happening at home, so running away felt like her only option. Mary was not a stranger to hitchhiking. It was the 70s after all, and it was very normal for teenagers to hitchhike, which I get it's the time period, but my God, like, as a kid, even in the 50s, you're just told not to get into a car with a stranger. I guess that came around the 60s. Oh yeah, with Dean Corll, I did another video about that. I'm getting off track. Anyway, while she was hitchhiking, she also saw 2 people down the road who were holding a very similar sign saying that they were also going to Southern California, and they would get car after car passing, and she was getting pretty frustrated because it was getting more towards the night at this point. But that is when a big blue van would pull up beside Mary, and a man would be driving this van, a man with a very scruffy appearance, and he would offer her a ride, and this man's name was Lawrence Singleton, and at first glance, he seemed harmless. If anything, he reminded Mary of her own father or a grandfather type figure, so no alarm bells were really ringing in her head. But that's when the 2 other hitchhikers would come up to the van and say that they were going to the same place, and they would see that the van was empty and that he could easily take 3 people, but Lawrence refused, and he said he could only take Mary. And now the alarm bells started to ring in Mary's head, but she really couldn't stay out much longer, 'cause she would literally have to spend the night out in the streets, basically, and she just really wanted to get to her grandfather's place. And the 2 people literally told Mary, "You should not get in the car with this guy. Like, this is bad news bears." But unfortunately, she was desperate to get back, so she got in the car, and inside the van, she said it smelt like cigarette smoke and sweat, kind of like my Aunt Lisa's house. But Singleton's easy and paternal demeanor quickly put Mary at ease, so they drove for a while, and everything seemed pretty normal. So Mary felt comfortable enough to doze off, 'cause she was really tired from standing all day hitchhiking. When she woke up, though, she started to notice that the signs on the road were different, and by different, I mean they were going in the wrong direction, and Mary would voice this to Lawrence, the driver. But then, without warning, Singleton veered off the freeway, and Mary's pulse quickened. Her instincts really started to flare at this point, and she asked him in a calm voice where he was going, and Singleton just told her that this was a shortcut, but the hairs on the back of Mary's neck started to stand up. Something was very wrong, so Mary would start to look around the car, just trying not to seem panicked, but also just trying to assess the situation and not to ring any alarm bells for Lawrence at this point, and she would notice that her shoelace was untied, and thinking that she might have to run away at some point, she said to herself, "Okay, I need to tie my shoelace." So once Lawrence pulled up to the middle of nowhere, she bent down to tie up her shoelace, and this is when Singleton's mood would shift abruptly. He became cold and predatory, and like I said, Mary had opened the door slightly to put her shoe up and tie her shoe, but before she was even able to think about making a run for it, a sledgehammer would strike her in the back of her head, and Mary would feel a hand grab her roughly and pull her out of the passenger seat, and he would force her onto the ground where her screams were just swallowed by the vast empty space around them, and he would unfortunately begin to essay her many times all through the day, all until the next morning, and Mary recalls screaming to him constantly, "Set me free. Please set me free." And by the morning, Mary felt that she was just drifting in and out of her body at this point, not believing what the hell was happening. But what came next would burn into her mind for the rest of her life. Singleton, without warning, would pull her out of the car at this point, 'cause they were in the back of the car. He would grab a hatchet out of his toolbox. He would grip her left arm, and he would say, "You want to be set free? I'll set you free." And with one swift and brutal motion, he would bring the hatchet down on her arm, cutting it clean off, and the shock was immediate for Mary, and Mary at this point began to fall back, and while falling back, she was confused how she was falling back, because she remembers when he grabbed her arm, she also grabbed onto him, so how could she be falling back? And that's when she would look down and realize her entire arm was gone, and it was actually still gripping onto Lawrence. And at this point, Megan began kicking and screaming while she was on the ground, hoping that someone could hear her, but no one was around. They were literally in the middle of nowhere, and as she kicked and screamed, he would bring the hatch down again, but now he was swinging at her right arm, and since she was moving around more, it would take more effort for him to cut her right arm off. And after he was done cutting it off, she would see him kind of start to walk away and flick something off, and then she realized that he was literally still trying to flick off her other arm that was still gripped onto him. And as she was laying there watching this, she realized that she needed to play dead in order to survive at this point. So Lawrence would walk back over to Mary, and thinking that she was already dead or close to dead, he would grab her body and drag her over to a 30-foot cliff side and toss her off, and Mary would break for ribs after she fell down, and obviously she was suffering from extreme blood loss at this point and would have both of her arms completely severed off, but something inside her refused to let go, so she would push herself up with every ounce of strength that she had left and told herself that she couldn't die, because she was not going to let this man and do this to another person. So naked, bleeding, and on the verge of death, she used her remaining strength to pack mud into her wounds in her stumps, so she would slow down the bleeding. Then she would climb back up that 30-foot cliff with no arms and nearly half her blood gone at this point, and though it would take a while for her to get up, she would get up to the top of that cliff, and by the time she reached the top, it was now pitch black outside in the middle of nowhere, mind you. So as she was walking through the brush, she would hear cars in from the distance, and that was probably where the road was, so she went towards the car noises, and soon she would make it to the side of a highway. And after she got to the side of the road, she was hoping and praying that a car would come by, and soon after a car did come by. It was a sports car with two men in it, but as she was waving for them to slow down. They would just speed right past her, and all her hope would just drain 'cause I can't even imagine going through all that, and then seeing just a glimpse of hope with headlights, and then it just going right by. But then also she kind of did understand that people weren't stopping, because she was literally a filthy, naked woman with no arms waving in the middle of the night on the side of the highway where no person should be. I personally, I mean, I would absolutely call the authorities. No, I'd stop because I've read too many of these stories. I would have stopped these guys, or these guys are, but anyway, thankfully, though not too long after a passing couple who were actually lost and on their honeymoon spotted Mary and realized the severity of her condition, unlike the other, and would rush to the nearest phone to call paramedics, with her in the car as well, and then she would be airlifted to the closest hospital, and upon arrival at the hospital, Mary was immediately placed into intensive care, and her condition was obviously critical. She had lost a tremendous amount of blood, half of her blood in fact, and her severed limbs were obviously a medical emergency that required immediate attention, so surgeons worked tirelessly to stabilize her condition and prevent infection, and to obviously close the wounds in her arms. And while it was impossible to reattach her arms due to the violence of the severing and due to the lack of arms that they had, doctors did manage to save her life, and in the weeks and months that followed, Mary's physical recovery was painstaking. She had to undergo multiple surgeries to manage the damage caused by the hatchet, and she was eventually fitted for prosthetic arms. But simple tasks now like eating and dressing became monumental tasks and challenges for her, and the psychological scars were in many ways deeper and more challenging to heal. Mary did suffer from PTSD in the aftermath of the attack, naturally, and she experienced vivid flashbacks and nightmares and intense fear, so counseling and therapy became a very vital part in her recovery as she grappled with the emotional devastation of her near-death experience. So after Mary Vincent was able to identify her attacker, providing a very detailed description of Lawrence Singleton, and police would track him down and arrest him at his home, and Singleton initially denied the accusations, attempting to paint himself as the victim, concocting bizarre stories to excuse his behavior. He claimed that Mary had threatened him and even attempted to blackmail him, but his attempts luckily were dismantled by the overwhelming evidence. The physical evidence was bloodstains and hair in Singleton's van that were Mary's, along with the hatchet that he used in the attack and some other DNA evidence. It was basically just like he was obviously the perpetrator. So in 1979, Lawrence Singleton stood trial for his crimes of kidnapping, rape, attempted murder, and mutilation, and the trial did draw considerable media attention, as the brutal nature of the crime and Mary's incredible survival captivated the public, and Mary Vincent, despite her trauma and ongoing recovery, took the stand and faced her attacker in court like a badass bitch. She recounted vivid detail of how Singleton essayed her and mutilated her and left her for dead, but her poise and courage in the face of such horror moved the jury and the audience alike. Singleton, on the other hand, showed no remorse in the trial. He would maintain his innocence throughout, despite the overwhelming evidence, and his attempts to shift the blame and cast himself as the victim only deepened the public outrage with him. But in the end, Lawrence Singleton was convicted of multiple charges, including attempted murder, rape, kidnapping, and mayhem. I didn't know mayhem was something you can get convicted of, but it said it, so I guess it is, and he was sentenced to a maximum penalty allowed under California law at the time, which was 14 years. 14 Years for mutilating a girl, chopping off her arms, raping her, and leaving her for dead, attempting to murder her, and they gave him 14 years, but wait, there's more. Naturally, the public was outraged for the sentencing and how little amount of time it was. The idea of a man who committed these attacks only getting 14 years ignited a wave of protests, particularly among victims' rights groups. Singleton became eligible for parole after just serving 8 years. And Singleton would get parole and be released early, and that would have disastrous consequences. No, so like I said, after serving only 8 years in prison, Lawrence Singleton was released on parole in 1987, and his release was a source of tremendous outrage and fear for many, particularly obviously Mary Vincent and her family. And Singleton's early release was justified on the grounds of good behavior. Incredible. So naturally this prompted protests, and every community he tried to settle in would not have it so. Basically, the whole public forced him to live on the trailer grounds of San Quentin State Prison, where he was staying in prison previously, which is kind of baller, but still not good enough. He should be in a jail, and the fears that many had about Singleton's release proved tragically justified, cuz on February 19th, 1997, 9 years after his release, Lawrence Singleton brutally murdered Roxanne Hayes, a 31-year-old mother of 3. Hayes was a lady of the night whom Singleton lured to his home, and once inside, he attacked her in a savage, unprovoked amount of violence, stabbing her repeatedly with a knife, and a neighbor would call the police after hearing screams, and an officer arrived at the scene to find Singleton covered in blood, standing over Hayes' lifeless body like the monster that he is. And Roxanne Hayes' murders would just shock the nation and reignited the public's outrage over Singleton's early release. So this time Singleton was charged with first-degree murder and the death penalty, and during his trial the details of Mary Vincent's case resurfaced, with Mary testifying, and he remained on death row until his death from cancer in 2001. He got off lucky, but the crimes committed by Lawrence Singleton had far-reaching effects on the American legal system. Singleton's attacks on Mary Vincent and his early release exposed glaring weaknesses in sentencing and parole laws, particularly for violent offenders. So his case became a very powerful symbol for advocates of victims' rights, leading to a significant legal reform in California and beyond. And these laws, often referred to as Singleton laws, were designed to prevent situations where individuals convicted of brutal crimes could be released before serving an adequate portion of their sentence. Yay, good job. I mean, actually, good job, but like, why it take you so long? So Mary Vincent, who had forever been changed by Singleton's attack, emerged as an advocate for victims' rights. She fought tirelessly for legal reforms and shared her story with the world in an effort to raise awareness about the dangers of violent offenders being released prematurely. And though the physical and emotional scars of her ordeal remain, Mary has turned her trauma into a platform for activism, seeking to ensure that no one else suffers at the hands of the criminal justice system's failures as she did. What a badass. And that brings us to our next story, which is about Allison Botha. It was a warm, unremarkable summer evening in December 1994, and yes, it's summer where she's from, 'cause she's not from where we're from, so it's December. It's summer, so don't come at me for that. This was in Port Elizabeth, South Africa, and Alice and Botha, a vibrant 27-year-old woman, had spent the day relaxing with friends. Her life was typical, filled with work, friendships, and plans for the future. She was independent, confident, and like many other women her age, looking forward to the possibilities of life. But on this night, a series of unimaginable events would unfold that would not only test her endurance but also transform her into one of the world's most remarkable survival stories. Ever so, December 18th, 1994, began like any other day for Allison. By the time evening came, she had been out with friends at the beach enjoying a typical Sunday evening and ending it all at a friend's house for dinner that night, and after she left for dinner, she had one of her friends come with her, so she would drop her friend off at their house and then she would make her way back to her apartment, planning to unwind and get some rest before the start of her work week. And the warm South African night was still and quiet as Allison pulled up to her apartment complex. So as she parked a car, she began gathering all of her things in her car. She had done laundry earlier, so she was kind of grabbing that from the back seat. Allison really had no reason to be alarmed. This was a fairly safe neighborhood she was in, but in an instant her sense of security was shattered as she would go to reach for the door handle. A man would appear out of nowhere and he would force himself into the car, forcing her to get into the passenger seat. His hands were large and rough, and before Allison could even process what was happening, he had a knife pressed against her neck, and he would say, "Move, and I kill you." And the man who had ambushed Allison was named France D. "If I said your name wrong, I don't really give a F because you're a piece of." He then lied to her and told her his name was Clinton, and minutes later his accomplice, the nose Kruger, which also don't know if I'm saying your name right, also don't give a, climbed into the back seat of Allison's car, and they would force her into the driver's seat. So as the car moved further and further away from her apartment, Allison's fear deepened. She knew she was being taken somewhere against her will, but she had no idea what awaited her, and any pretense of harmless intentions evaporated as the men literally told her what their plans were. So the car would drive through Port Elizabeth's quiet streets further and further from any sign of life or safety. And as they sped through the night, Allison's mind was flooded with thoughts of escape. But with a knife pressed against her skin, it was just a constant reminder that any attempt she made to flee could end up in her dying. And the drive would stretch on until they reached a deserted area from outside the city limits, a stretch of basically desolate wilderness where no one could hear you scream. So the car would come to a stop, and in the eerie silence of the night the two men would turn to Allison. And it was then that the full horror of the situation became very clear to her. Allison would be dragged out of the car and onto the ground, and both men would take turns brutally saying her. And Allison, though absolutely terrified and in tremendous amounts of pain, stayed calm and just focused on survival. She knew that resisting would probably only worsen her situation, and she just clung to the faint belief that maybe if she endured all of this, they might let her go. But after everything was done, one of the guys tried to strangle her. She would not die from the strangulation, but that's when France Dutas, the ringleader, turned to Kruger and said coldly, "She has to die." And that's when Dua would pull out a knife and start slashing at Allison's throat, and the knife would cut through her skin with such force that her windpipe and trachea was severed. So Allison's body was just racked with pain at this point, and she was just struggling for breath. But they weren't finished. They would also stab her repeatedly in the stomach 36 times in total, completely disemboweling her in the process, and she would be conscious the whole time. And eventually she said that she felt no pain, I'm assuming due to shock. So they casually just discarded of Allison's body and her clothes and threw them near her and got in their car and left. So in a state of shock and barely conscious, Allison's mind was still fighting. Her injuries were catastrophic at this point, and she would just stare up at the night sky, kind of drifting in and out of consciousness, hearing kind of a whistling, wheezing noise while she was staring up, and little did she know at the time that that whistling, wheezing noise was actually because of the severe damage that they caused to her neck, and it was her severed windpipe and the wind blowing in and out of it because she was nearly decapitated at this point, and her intestines also laid on the outside of her body, exposed to the cold air, and while she was lying there just in complete disbelief of what happened, she remembered that the guys thought she was going to die, so they started referring to each other in their actual names. Franz and Ion, and similar to Mary Vincent, she didn't want what happened to her to happen to any other girl, so she would struggle, but she would manage to get her arm up and write their names in the sand beside her, along with writing "I love Mom" below, just in case she didn't make it. And it was also then that she remembered that the guys had thrown her clothes near her, so she would reach out and realize that her denim shirt was there, and she would use that denim shirt to kind of gather all of her organs around her and put them back into her body cavity and hold them there, and then she would try to get up onto her knees to start crawling, but then she realized that everything was dark, and when she went up to go feel her head with her other hand, she would realize that her head wasn't there, and it was only her throat, because her head was literally hanging back off of her neck, so she would have to manually put her head back and hold it while she crawled to what she could only hope was safety. So she knew that there was a road nearby, so she painstakingly and agonizingly slow crawled to that road. But she would make it, and as soon as she made it, she pretty much just collapsed. And also, like Mary Vincent, there would be a car that would zoom right past her. And she said that she didn't even really feel bad, 'cause she kind of understood. Because like, who would stop for somebody? Just like brutally, I would, okay. Shortly after that first car sped by and saw her, another car would speed by and slam on their brakes, and this car was full of students, one of which was a veterinarian student named T.N. Ellard. And he got out of the car immediately and was horrified by what he saw. He would see her blood-soaked clothes and her exposed insides and her severed throat, but Allison at this point would finally feel some comfort, 'cause she could see on his face that he was carrying, and he was going to try to help her, and T would try to keep her awake and conscious by asking her yes or no questions and telling her to squeeze his hand yes or no to just make sure that she was still alert and alive, and the people with TN would then call first responders, but they would take over an hour and a half to arrive at the scene. But if Tan wasn't there, she probably would have died. So at the hospital, the medical staff was absolutely stunned by the extent of Allison's injuries and the fact that she was still alive, and the doctors would work frantically to stabilize her condition, performing multiple surgeries on her throat and abdomen, and the fact that she had survived the attack alone was a miracle. And Allison would spend weeks and weeks in the hospital fighting to overcome infection, pain, and the emotional scars left by the attack, and the physical recovery was grueling. She underwent extensive reconstructive surgeries, and her rehabilitation required an enormous amount of resilience, but slowly her body began to heal. But despite everything, Allison's spirit remained unbroken. Even in the midst of her recovery, she was determined to bring her attackers to justice, 'cause she was the key in solving her own case. So Allison's incredible survival meant that she was able to provide police with a very detailed description of her attackers. She had seen their faces, heard their voices, and even knew their names, and with her testimony, the police were able to quickly locate and arrest Franduta and Theans Kruger. And when the men were brought to trial, Allison's bravery shone once again. Despite the trauma that she had endured, she took the stand and recounted the horrific details of her attack, and her testimony was powerful, and the evidence against Dee and Kruger were overwhelming, and also the doctors told her, like, you should not be doing this because you just had throat surgeries, you can't talk, like, don't do this, and she was just like, take this out of my throat, I'm putting these guys in jail. So both men would be convicted of multiple charges, including kidnapping, rape, and attempted murder, and mutilation. Frauenau kept claiming that a demon was trapped inside of his body and told him to do those things, but police obvious vias ly saw right through him, and that didn't work, so Judge Chris Jansen sentenced Franz and Thunes to life in prison without the chance of parole. That's how you do it, okay? That's how you do it. You don't say 14 years, and let's just let him out for good behavior after 8. You know, and a lovely little tidbit after is that TN, the veterinarian student who's now a doctor, became a doctor and actually delivered one of the 2 of Allison's babies later in life. And they also told her she never be able to have kids, but she went on to have 2. This chick is just like as bad as they come in the best way. And in the years following the attack, Allison's story became a beacon of hope and resilience for countless of people around the world. She refused to be defined by the brutality she had endured, and instead use her experience to inspire others. There's also been a 2016 documentary made about her life story as well, called Allison. So yeah, that's Allison both. She absolute queen. Absolute, I can't the whole. Like, I can't reading that I was like, oh my go, you can't help but put yourself in those shoes. And I mean, like, you can't really, like, I was like, what would I do? I don't know. I would I would love to think that I'd be as awesome as her, but I don't really know. I don't really know. The fact is, she's badass. She's still living and she's still inspiring, and I love that. Let's move on to the last story, and that is Jamie Claus. So it was a quiet autumn night on October 15th, 2018 in Barron, Wisconsin. 13-year-old Jamie Claus was at home with her parents, James and Denise, in their cozy rural house surrounded by thick woods and open fields. The evening had passed like any other. Jamie, a bright and active girl, was likely winding down for a school day, enjoying the security of her family and familiar surroundings. But what Jamie didn't know is that there was a stranger that had been watching her. Jake Patterson, a 21-year-old man from a nearby town, had spotted her getting off a school bus one day, and in his mind, a plan began to take shape, one that would soon shatter her peaceful life. So, as the CLA family slept, Patterson pulled up outside their house in his older model car, the tires crunching against the gravel, and dressed in all black and armed with a shotgun. Patterson had already decided that nothing would stand in his way, not even Jamie's parents. His heart raced with anticipation as he cut the engine and stepped out into the cool Wisconsin night, and the house was dark and still when Patterson approached the front door at around 12:53 a.m. with a shotgun in hand. James, Jim's father, was startled by a sudden pounding on the door and the dog barking as well. The banging was so loud and forceful it shattered the calm of the night, and instinctively, being the man of the house, James got up to see who was at the door. But before he could unlock it, Patterson blasted through the front entrance, firing a shot directly into James' face, killing him instantly. Jamie, terrified by the sound of gunfire, ran to the bathroom with her mother Denise. The two would huddle together in the small room as their hearts pounded, praying that the intruder wouldn't find them, and Denise, acting on instinct, dialed 911 but could barely get any words out before Patterson broke down the door, and Jamie's ears rang as Patterson stormed into the bathroom. He ripped the phone from Denise's hand and ordered her to hang up and also to put a piece of tape over Jim's mouth. Denise would comply, but It was then that Patterson would hold up the shotgun and shoot her right in front of Jamie she had just witnessed both of. Her parents murdered her world at this point was collapsing around her, but the nightmare was far from over. Patterson would then take her outside and stuff her in the trunk of his car, slamming it shut and speeding off into the night. And, like I said, at 12:53 a.m., a 911 call was placed by Denise, but there were no words spoken. The dispatcher could hear yelling and disturbance in the background, but not Mel's police would also be dispatched, and they would arrive at the residence within 4 minutes, and Patterson and Jamie would already be gone, and upon arrival they would find the front door kicked in and the bodies of James and Denise with no sign of Jamie Claus. So the Barron County Sheriff's Department would launch a massive search for Jamie, fearing that she had been abducted. Amber alerts were issued, and the FBI joined the investigation as well, and the community really rallied together, holding visuals, organizing search parties, and clinging to the hope that Jamie was still alive and back in the trunk of Patterson's car. Jamie felt like it was an eternity of a drive. She was trapped in this claustrophobic zone of lines of a trunk. She had no idea at this point where Patterson was taking her, but one thing was clear, and that was that she was completely at his mercy. And after what seemed like hours, the car would finally stop, and Patterson would doctor Jamie out of the trunk and led her into a remote cabin in Gordon, Wisconsin. About 70 miles from her home, the cabin was very isolated and surrounded by dense woods and far removed from prying eyes. And inside, Patterson kept Jamie captive, forcing her to stay hidden under a bed. In his sparse furnished room, the bed was surrounded by heavy boxes and weighed down with furniture, creating a very small, suffocating space that Jam was forced to crawl into, and Patterson threatened her with death if she tried to escape or make any sort of noise. And for 88 days, Jam lived in a constant state of fear, her entire world just reduced to this small, cramped space beneath a bed. 88 days, what a piece of monster, and every passing day just felt like a lifetime to Jamie. He would leave her alone for hours, sometimes even days, during which she remained trapped under the bed without food or water or access to a bathroom, and Jamie didn't know if anyone was searching at her at this point, or if she would ever be found. She could only wait and watch for an opportunity and hope for a way out, and the chance would come on January 10th, 2019, on a cold winter's day. Jamie, being such a smart girl, grew very used to the patterns of Patterson's behavior. She could sense when he was leaving for longer periods, and on this particular day he had left the cabin for a couple hours, telling her he was going out, and for the first time in months, Jam felt a spark of hope. This was her chance, her one and only chance to escape. So her heart pounded as she crawled out from beneath the bed. She knew she had to move extremely quickly, but her hands were trembling with the weight of all the fear. What if he came back? What if she got caught? Pushing those thoughts aside as much as she could, Jamie darted out of the cabin into the freezing cold of the wilderness that surrounded her, wearing only an ill-fitting pair of shoes and very light clothing. She would run through the snowy terrain, her breath sharp with the biting winter air, and the snow crunched beneath her feet as she made her way down a road that she had never seen before. She didn't know where she was, but all she knew is that she had to keep going, and after running for some time, she spotted a woman walking her dog, and her name was Jean Nutter, and as soon as she saw Jamie, she knew something was terribly wrong. Jamie, breathless and cold, told Jean she was Jamie Claus, the missing girl that everyone had been searching for, and Jean knew basically right away, because the whole city had been plastered with Jaws' face all over it, and Jean would take Jay to a nearby neighbor's house where they immediately called police, and Jamie provided critical information about Patterson, including his name and the description of his vehicle, and acting swiftly on Jim's information. Law enforcement officers apprehended Patterson as he drove through a neighborhood searching for Jamie, which is just so scary, but they would catch him, quite literally, the same day, so the nightmare was finally over and Jamie had escaped, and Jake Patterson would confess to the murder of her parents and abducting Jamie, saying he had meticulously planned the crime. After seeing Jamie by chance, and he was charged for 2 counts of first-degree intentional homicide and 1 count of kidnapping, and in March 2019 he pleaded guilty to all charges, and during the sentencing hearing in May of 2019, Patterson showed a little remorse, saying that he was deeply sorry but acknowledging that his words might mean nothing to those he had hurt. And the judge would sentence Patterson to 2 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole for the murders, plus an additional 40 years for the kidnapping. Yes, that's how you convict. The sentence was ensured that he would spend the rest of his miserable life in prison. So Jam's story captured the nation's attention. It was a story of resilience and survival in the face of unimaginable terror at such a young age too, and after her escape, Jamie returned to her family, slowly beginning the process of healing, and though the trauma of those 88 days will always be with her, Jamie's courage and strength have inspired countless people around the world, including myself, and she has chosen to remain largely out of the public eye, focusing more on rebuilding her life and support with her family, and in 2019, she was awarded the Hometown Hero Award by Wisconsin State Assembly for her incredible bravery. Jamie Claus is not just a survivor, she's a symbol of hope and proof that even in the darkest moments there is always a chance for escape and survival. So that concludes the video. I hope you enjoyed hearing about these just incredible women. I know this isn't like the usual thing that I do, but I think it's important. I think it's inspiring and amazing and heart-wrenching at the same time. As always, if you have any other video ideas, let me know in the comments below. And if you like the video, like the video. If you want to subscribe also. Grab some sour boys. I know we talked about some sour subjects, but grab something a little sweet. Go to sour and I'll make a code for you. Let's do code badass, because all these women were absolute badasses, and we're going to do 15% off first 500 people to use this code. Get 15% off, so run, go do it. Get something sweet. Other than that, I appreciate you. I hope you stay safe, and I will see you a beautiful face in the next video. All right, bye. Please feel free to comment below if you like this article. Remember to like and subscribers for more.